Hi, Daniel here from Daniel Thornton English, and today we're going to be taking a look at an IELTS deep dive. Now, a deep dive is where I have a little bit more of an opportunity to explain in some detail some of the key questions that come up from either, people I've collaborated with or people who have kind of asked a question via a platform such as LinkedIn. And maybe the short format of the kind of like LinkedIn area, or like kind of just, that makes it difficult to really dive deeply into some of these answers. So hopefully today I'll be able to shine a little bit more of a light on some of the concerns that many of you might have. And a question came up from Martina living in and near Verona in Italy. And she basically asked me about IELTS, and she said that she wasn't sure whether she should take the B2 variant of IELTS or the C1 variant of IELTS. And she asked my kind of support and advice. And of course, I'm happy to help her and other people who are in this boat. So to kind of go back a little bit, it's important to acknowledge that there are different types of English language test, each with their own positives and negatives, and each with their own kind of personality, shall we say. And one of these is the fact that some English language exams are leveled. For example, the Cambridge exams, like FCE, CAE, CPE, are specifically leveled tests. So in this case, an exam like FCE, the first certificate of English, is leveled and targeted at students who are at or around B2 on the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference. And that means that the questions are set with the expectation that they would be a good challenge for B2 candidates, not too easy, not too difficult, and ideally, by the end of the test, a B2 candidate would kind of walk out of the room with a demonstration of B2 knowledge, which would be 6.0 in IELTS if we were to convert that way. Then the exam that goes up from that, CAE, Cambridge Advanced English, is designed to be a test for C1 candidates or advanced users of the language, 7.0 on IELTS. There are some advantages to a test like this. One of the advantages is that these tests are set for that level. So a candidate should know that they're not going to face C2 level problem solving in a B2 test. At the same time, they should also be aware that the test is going to be at a steady speed. Excuse my pause there for a moment. Happens to the best of us. In this case, this steady speed also enables a candidate to mentally be ready for the expectation of the test. That's a good thing. And I do think that the Cambridge tests offer a good challenge to candidates. And if a university or a visa issuing authority accepts it, and a candidate has got a reasonable level of confidence in their level and has done lots of practice with it, that's not a bad option. However, there are a couple problems with the Cambridge exams, and one of them is that not every university or visa issuing authority accepts them. It's simply not something that's well known, as much as TOEFL or IELTS or other exams, for instance. And so there's always a risk of doing the exam, and then the university or visa issuing authority says, well, we don't accept that. And then the candidate has done all that work, they've got the level that they thought would be sufficient, and then they just get a no because that specific certificate or exam was not accepted. This is why I always recommend for anyone looking to gain an English language test for proof of language proficiency to check with whoever is going to be making that decision before the decision is made. That is something which I highly recommend. The other disadvantage of having a test that's specifically on one level is there's a sense of missing out on potentially lower level questions. So in a test like IELTS, in the listening part of the test, part 1 of the listening test is objectively easier than part 4. The speech rate is slower, the vocabulary and grammar structures that are used are less complex. So there's a lot of opportunity to gain points in that part of the test that probably would not happen in a level test. Once you go into a level test, boom, on the ground floor, you're at the level test that you are being assessed on. There's no kind of warm up on that or lead in. Another possible disadvantage of a test like Cambridge, FCE, CAE, CPE, is that the speaking part is done with a partner. This adds a level of complexity and social difficulty that is not there in other language tests. In other language tests, for example, IELTS, TOEFL, PTE, the speaking is done individually and there is no second partner to consider in that equation. With the Cambridge tests, for example, speaking with a partner can involve things like turn taking, which can be challenging if the partner talks too much to get a turn, or if the partner doesn't talk enough, having this awkward silence in the air where you're doing all the heavy lifting, you pass it to your partner rightly and they do nothing with it. Very difficult to negotiate that without significant practice beforehand. And by the way, if you would ever have any questions about practicing or would like to know more about that, feel free to reach out to me at LinkedIn, Daniel Thornton English, at email, danielthorntonenglish@outlook.com, and I would be happy to answer your questions. Moving on to other types of language test, the second type is non-prescriptive. What that means is that the language test itself has not determined a level for you before you start. You simply walk in and you get the score you get. So in the case of IELTS, you walk in the room and you can get anywhere from 0.0 to 9.0. 0.0 being you produced nothing of any correctness or any correct value, and you walk out of the room with what you walked in with, which was nothing. 9.0 is the absolute maximum that can be attained, and that requires a high degree of skill and sophistication and a lot of tricks and tips that are acquired in the journey of learning a language for thousands of hours. That's simply, there are one or two ways in which the game can be played, but ultimately to get a 9.0, it is a very, very, very difficult thing to do. And less than 1 in 1,000 people attain that score for a very good reason. But in this case, what that means is that the candidate lives or dies by their own performance. So however many questions are answered correctly in the reading test is how many points are attained, and that corresponds to a level. In the writing, the quality and the clarity of writing is what is assessed, and that is assessed by an examiner who works now remotely, and they are highly trained, highly specialized individuals. I should know, I was trained and I was an examiner for 4 years in IELTS. So there's a lot of elements of that which mean that a candidate has basically good pressure. They start with 0 and they go on and they prove what they can do in the best possible way. In a similar way, an exam like TOEFL is also non-prescriptive. You start with 0 and you aim for a maximum of 30 points in each section. The mechanism by which it's measured is a little bit different. TOEFL leans a lot more on AI, for instance, in the speaking and writing assessment. And this is why when a candidate does TOEFL, they do it just basically with a prompt and a computer screen, and the answer is recorded. With IELTS, it's a human being as an examiner, at least for now. And basically the difference there is that while both are intended to extract language data, one of them does it on the basis of a software that lines up a candidate's performance as an approximation, in the case of TOEFL, whereas IELTS is a lot more, I guess, subjective and down to the interpretation of that examiner on that day. That does not mean that either approach is perfect. I'm not here advocating for one or the other, and ultimately what is right for one test taker is correct for them. I'm here to support that. I've taught both TOEFL and IELTS, and I'm here to continue helping people along the way to make sure they do the test that is right for them. So in that case, it simply becomes more of a case of what's more comfortable and what's more appropriate, which type of questions maybe are more suitable, or which kind of type of activity works better, or if a candidate is more extroverted or introverted, or more tech savvy or less tech savvy. So lots of elements in play there, and I'm happy to kind of go through with you, and have done and continue to do so with many of you. Then The third kind of exam is where the test is called adaptive. So all the exams I've mentioned so far, Cambridge, IELTS, and TOEFL, are pre-created. Those exams are created, and no matter how the candidate performs on the day, that test is the test. That's it. You walk in the room, either the test center or at home, as you can in the case of TOEFL. You open up your screen or your paper, your booklet, and the test is there in front of you, and it doesn't change. No matter how good or bad you're feeling, no matter how well you perform, no matter how easy or difficult it is, that test is fixed. But some tests have begun to introduce a more dynamic nature to their questioning. I've heard stories that exams like PTE have done so, where they respond to the quality of performance from the candidate. I've heard stories that the exam gets more difficult objectively the better a candidate is doing, which is interesting because that should really kind of be something that is a debate for another day. But whether a candidate should be almost penalized for doing well, it is definitely an ethical consideration that merits further discussion. There are also other exams that I've heard of, not just in the English language world, but in other languages too, that rely more on this dynamic nature, this adaptive nature. I, for example, many years ago did the GRE test in advance of doing my master's here in the US. And the GRE test, I have a high suspicion, was adaptive too, even though it was back in 2014. Wow, long time ago. I definitely had the sense that the test was easier or more difficult according to how I was performing, which was simultaneously reassuring and scary. The fact that I had a bit of a comfort to get an easier question when I fell off the horse a little bit was nice, but I did feel like a lot of times I was being asked to do more than maybe I was ready for, and, luckily in the end I got the score I needed. But the adaptive nature of a test can be quite scary and is certainly a possibility on a computer-based test because the technology is connected to the Wi-Fi and they can just adapt. I certainly know, for instance, working with software platforms such as McGraw-Hill Connect here in the US, that technology exists and is used. So it would not surprise me at all if that were the case in some online exams and if that continued to grow. Last but not least, the interesting thing here about whether or not a test is leveled or should be leveled ultimately comes down to what one considers to be sufficient evidence of language production. In the case of listening and reading, especially with multiple choice answers, there is quite a clear right or wrong answer. For example, if you're doing a listening exercise and there's a map, and they quite clearly say that building A is to the left of the main road, and there is only one building to the left of the main road, then that is the right answer. In the same way, a reading test should really only have one correct answer for the candidate to identify. Otherwise, it's poor exam design. But with writing and speaking, to my mind at least, it's a lot more subjective, where the individual examiner or software's preference or ability to detect what constitutes an error, that's definitely something that merits further exploration. There's been a lot of research done on large language models, and certainly there are benefits aplenty to a candidate having access to what a large language model can do. But whether or not LLMs and AI software is absolutely, without doubt, the best way to measure something as subjective as pronunciation or fluency is, again, perhaps a topic for another day. And maybe when I do future Q&A sessions and future deep dives, I might explore those in more detail. But in the meantime, it's been wonderful to have you all on here for this IELTS deep dive, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.